My name is Andy Cahan, Director of Author Events, and I am very excited to finally introduce our guest tonight. Mark Z. Danielewski has said, "Writing is something that's innate in me. It's a desire to put pieces together that are outside of me, and it's a way of exploring the dimensions of this world. In some ways, the way a mathematician can reach the end of the universe without traveling there, using the language of numbers. There's a way to reach the ends of the heart and the soul by using words." By all accounts, he has achieved this goal in his kaleidoscopic creations, House of Leaves, which he says is about film, Only Revolutions, which is about music, and The 50-Year Sword, which is about the campfire or the oral tale. What is The Familiar about? Lydia Millett in the LA Times wrote, "Volume 1 is a sprawling postmodern monument to semantic encryption, part paean, part parody, performance art as well as book." But that's only the beginning. He joins us tonight to tell us about Volume 4, among other things. Please welcome Mark Z. Danielewski.
What miracle is this giant tree? It stands 10,000 feet high, but doesn't reach the ground. Still it stands. Its roots must hold the sky. That's it. It's my grounding moment. So how does one read from Volume 4 when there have been 3 previous volumes? It's tricky. I don't want to be too spoilerish. And at the same time, I think it's a fun way to kind of get perhaps at some of the larger themes that are working through this large novel in 27 parts. So for those of you who don't know, it's about a little girl who finds a kitten. And there are about 9 significant narrators in this novel. So let's start with the father. This takes place in 2014. When both Anwar's parents were killed, coding recalled him from grief. Over the years, coding had saved Anwar from many things. Not that anyone watching him peck at his keyboard now or getting an over-the-shoulder view of the screen could sense it. On display here is nothing resembling the magical flow demonstrated by athletes like Serena Williams or an up-and-comer like Steph Curry, or Ashima Qureshi, a 13-year-old rock climber starting to make a name for herself. The clip, thanks to Astair's dad, along with the note, "For Xanther, aspire." Anwar knows all this because he once embraced a moment of absolute self-involvement, self-reflection, narcissism, egotism, and recorded himself programming for 2 hours. The first 40 minutes were expected, deletes and slouches combined with typing, followed by more deleting, some chin-rubbing too, plus 1 nose pick. His behavior had seemed a pretty good approximation of the way his mind was always stuttering with distractions and mistakes. For the next hour and 20 minutes, however, Anwar sank deep into a fluid zone where what no recording could show, but Anwar knew to have been the case, he lost track of himself and everything else he was trying to do. Even the trying itself was gone. The task, too, at hand ceased to be trying. Because in the end, only the task itself remains, replacing even, finally, necessarily, Anwar himself, the only one, after all, capable of failure, error, exhaustion, tracking time. With this inexorable flow, needing no other aim or purpose than the constant re-arrival of, in this making, this doing, this undoing too, this discovery. Such a state had taught Anwar to understand the famous Michelangelo maxim differently. The sculptor need only free the statue held captive within the stone. C'è un marmo solo in sé, non circonscriva col suo soverchio. The point was not about the stone, or the artist, or even the statue, but about something else. When the artist lets go of any thought for the artist, and lets go of the demands made by the stone, and lets go of the idea of the statue. What reveals itself is the indefatigable resources of disclosure, and as endless as there are universes, Mephisto once quipped. For those who have never experienced such a state, this description might seem contradictory, an impossible cone purposed only to muddle. Yet, this is not to suggest that the artist's stone statue is ever anything but present, only that. The immense power of revelation renders all else inconsequential. Was that the same as absolute samadhi, or positive samadhi, or any samadhi? Not that Anwar wants to elevate coding to artistry, substitute artist for coder, stone for code, statue for program. It's just that Anwar knows so well this zone, the zone. No amphetamines needed, forget Adderall, even caffeine, because the energy comes from without. The irony is that the recording reveals these 80 golden minutes to be indistinguishable from the previous 40 minutes. Both parts are replete with the same chin rubs and slouches. The only thing missing? One nose pick. So now let's hear from Mom. This is all my fault. I couldn't call him, she'd supposedly murmured in the hospital. If I could have just given him his name, it never would have happened, she muttered incoherently, again in the hospital. I'm such a loser. Why can't I come up with his name, she had lamented, only yesterday. To which Anwar had replied, Daughter, do you know one of the major differences between dogs and cats? Dogs know their names, and cats do not. The speculation is that dogs evolved in relation to hunter cultures. A name for calling then was crucial. Cats, on the other hand, evolved in relation to agrarian cultures. Territory is a cat's concern. Maybe you can't come up with a name because you instinctively understand that cats don't need names. Esther had been impressed. Maybe Anwar should write her paper. Xanther was less convinced. Then why is he wandering around the house, or why isn't he wandering around the house, staking his claim? Oh, I think he's staked his territory pretty clearly. He has? You. Of course, there was another reason the cat wasn't wandering around the house that much. If he wasn't very young, he was extremely old and ailing, and despite such obvious frailty, still capable of conducting near miraculous effects. Esther had seen it for herself. She was there at the airport to take them home. Gaunt Anwar, the first thing she saw, how it galled Esther to hear people say a black man couldn't look pale, similar to the yearly insensitivities that deny Los Angeles its seasonal shifts. Just because one isn't aware of the subtle turns during the hot times doesn't mean fall isn't coming. Not that there was anything seasonal or subtle about the grayness of Anwar's lips. Upon his cheek had his hair turned grayer, winter too, arriving early. Xanther was invisible beneath a blanket. Anwar was behind the wheelchair. Then he was helping her out, carrying her to the element. The poor thing shivering. She felt cold too in the heat of that September night, Friday, September 5. Gaunt couldn't describe her, or pale. Crackler porcelain, rice paper, an insurrection of bones impeaching skin, demanding bruise and blood, ruptured cuticles, contusions on her arms. Esther hadn't even beheld yet her knees, or the weird marks, the claws or teeth upon her neck. A tongue bruised so badly it was black as a cobra. Xanther's eyes had seemed inked in blood. Worse, she could barely move. Her lips against Esther's cheek kissed like ancient snow, whispering like dying snow. Esther almost lost it. Anwar, though, knew what to do. He insisted that Esther drive. He flooded her with the medical details, what the staff at the hospital had done, packing Xanther in a bed of foam pads and metal guards, guarding over her, what they had said, the subclinical seizures they suspected, the subclinical seizures they could never confirm, the midazolam, benzodiazepine they administered, all the other medicines they had subsequently recommended, prescriptions, short-term and long-term, whether used or not, some already waiting at Rite Aid, the rest at another nearby pharmacy. That became the big dilemma on the drive home, whether or not to stop at the pharmacies before they got home. "I don't want to stop," Xanther had whimpered from the back seat. And that was that. "I'll retrieve the medication once she's settled," Anwar had offered without hesitation, a trip he never had to make. Anwar even had to carry Xanther from the car, her weakness matched only by her confusion over whether this was really her home. Esther had started to shake. How is it, then, that even now, just a finger under so ridiculously a small jaw, white is never spoiled, is never broken, is never misplaced, as white can never mean, soft as warm snow, what cold could melt, afford Xanther, revive Xanther, no longer in need of revival, affording them both such large measures of pleasure. That little purr helps too. Xanther sure smiles, giggling now, something admittedly cute about those peculiar feline eyes, squeezing even more tightly shut, provoking a little amusing snarl, which reveals a tier of tiny, glistening teeth, almost too many, as paws stretch out, front paws, revealing claws. So many claws. Had Esther ever noticed that before? Look how many claws. The back paws, too. More than 5, more than 6. Dr. Sid's evaluation coming back to her. Esther snatching up the word. Polydactyl. TFV2, page 103. And then there's a yawn and something like a burp or a peep, and Xanther smiling more and laughing, and so is Esther. Even if something is still off, though just slightly, not enough for sure to call into question any general catness. From the too many nails to the not enough teeth, or wait, isn't it too many too? To the odd frizz of whiskers as if burned off, to the weird eyebrow, or is it an eyelash, one long white hair, poking out above the right eye to just how small it is, to how blind it is too. They have to get back to the vet soon. As soon as they've gotten the New York bills sorted. What will those be? Because there is no point in denying anymore that this small vial of white is not only their pet, but the best thing that ever happened to Xanther. Esther had seen with her own eyes, they all had, what happened when Anwar had carried Xanther across the threshold, Freya and Shasti racing ahead in angel mode, leading the way up to Xanther's room. But Anwar never made the first stair. The little thing was already in the foyer. Had it arrived, or had it already been there, waiting, before Esther could notice? It was already on Anwar's shoe, and then leaping blindly as high as Anwar's thigh. Had she ever seen it leap? I mean, like this, so desperately, and continuing upward on grit and claw alone, and determination. "Oh, my, ow," Anwar had cried, unable to do more, arms filled with Xanther. "Get it off me." But before anyone could react to this fast flight of white, both Freya and Shasti looked as stunned and bemused as Esther was, as even Anwar was. The little animal had already reached Xanther, nuzzling her chin, nuzzling her lips, licking her cheeks, licking her nose, nuzzling her ears, licking her lips, her chin. And like in some ridiculous fairy tale, Xanther had started to wiggle in her father's arms, forcing him to set her down as she cradled the cat, reciprocating with nuzzles of her own and strokes and cuddles and "I missed you so much," rubbing its tiny belly and its wildly whipping tail. What a purr that thing had offered up then, as Xanther forgot her torpor, the waxy whiteness in her cheeks seeming to forget itself too. A moment later, Xanther was racing up the stairs, disappearing into her room with the little one. Esther had ceased to matter. The same was true for the twins. Even Anwar no longer existed, though he seemed greatly relieved, his own color returning to his face and lips. How he had hugged Esther then and kissed little Shasti and little Freya. The only thing then that existed for Xanther, or mattered, were they the same thing? Was that cat? Yet maybe it was that singular, all-encompassing presence. Was that another addition to this triumvirate? Matter equals existence equals presence? Or was it due to its attention, or better, attention? No tension, it to it, to her, that had drawn Xanther away from herself, so that she might return to herself again and find herself whole. By the end of the weekend, most of the bruises were fading. Never that bad. A new rudolent glow had flushed her face. Her tongue showed not even a hint of the savage chewing the seizure had exacted upon it. On Monday, she was back in school. Disbelief still reigns for Astaire on this Thursday morning over Xanther's vitality, nearly all evidence of the attack having vanished. Even those abused cuticles looked particularly healthy, nails gleaming and sharp. Sharp? How'd you sleep, darling? I'm not tired, Xanther shrugs, rummaging through the kitchen cupboards for food matching her idea of breakfast. What can I fix for you? I don't know. Any dreams? Yeah, actually, I was building a ship too big for any ocean. There goes my room key. All right, this last section, I don't even know how to explain this. It's about an older scientist on the run, and she's got an orb. And now and then she pays a lot of attention to this orb. The previous night, Cass had managed to scry for nearly 12 hours. But no matter how much she searched, and she searched and searched, she discovered nothing on Recluse that was of ethical use. What was of no ethical use, she found easily enough online. Cass would willingly play Clotho and maybe even Lachesis, but never Atropos. At the end, by way of a reward, she returned to the aberrations again, to herself, to Xanther, revisiting clip number 1 through clip number 6. Allies had provided them with cots behind a woodshed south of Danbury. Bobby admitted later that he'd been dreaming of Egyptian sheets and Turkish towels. Cass had been with someone else's dream. Gettysburg, a lone captain in Union blue, wandering among his men on Cemetery Ridge the night before the third day, eyeing Pickett's encampment with both reverie and fear. July 3rd, 1863, 2 a.m. This wasn't an aberration or even a clip. What finally settled into meaning came only from what Cass could catch on his lips. The heart quickens at such a message, born under a cool and ageless moon, where men's souls flicker brightly like candles set in slender lanterns made of iron and glass. Men have died for more in that they live their life in full. And yet in this respect, we seem undaunted. 100, 1,000, 1,000 more, and all awake now to every blink and breath that brings us a closer step to dawn. Sleep well, I should say, and sleep long. But as I listen to their voices and I hear the current of their songs, what different words press against my lips? I say, do not sleep, soldier. Do not sleep at all. Live this night to presume this life your dream, for to this dream you'll long to return, when at break of day distant thunder roars, and you feel yourself falling, and you see and hear no more. Thank you.
I was just wondering, did you have any plans to, in the future, or when you're not working on your 27 volumes, collaborate with your sister at all in coming out with some music, maybe to promote the whole Familiar series?
The magic of 2000 and 2001. When my sister was writing Haunted, for those of you who don't know, I was listening to those tracks and they were influencing the writing of House of Leaves. And then I would show her chapters and that would influence Haunted. And so it was very much kind of like an Escher drawing of the two hands creating each other. And it was so synchronous and so easy that we assumed that we would keep doing it, you know. And I guess the clue in it is that we didn't really plan it, you know. And then when we tried to assemble plans for new projects, it became very difficult. You know, the tides and currents of the recording industry are so much different than publishing, and so things just, you know, haven't aligned. Now, that's not to say that maybe they won't, but it won't be because we planned it.
When you write the blue chapters, does that stream of conscious just flow out, or is that construct in its own certain special language?
I'm sorry, which chapters?
With Jing Jing?
Oh, right, yes.
And would you favor us with maybe a paragraph or half a page of reading that?
Yeah. So the question's about a character named Jing Jing who lives in Singapore and is an addict. And, oh no, it's definitely not stream of consciousness. I have been to Singapore. I've talked to people who know Singlish, who speak Singlish. Singlish is a Creole, basically. It's a combination of English and Hokkien and Putonghua, and it's a very complicated, rich, you know, structured lexicon for a sort of different set of the populace in a very wealthy country like Singapore. So a lot of work, and you know, it's funny. I'm not going to read a passage, but I'm getting up my gumption to do it. You know, it's one thing to sort of to channel those voices in a way, but to sort of perform them is almost another thing, and it's fraught with all sorts of perils. So maybe I'm just not brave enough, but I'm getting there. So stick around.
Thanks for coming to Philadelphia, first and foremost. It's really nice to see you in person. And I'm really glad that you're writing these books. I'm really excited to read Volume 4. One thing I think about a lot, though, when I read them is you write these books are enormously complicated in print and storyline, but the physical nature of these books, they're very heavy. They're very difficult to print. And I know that you, at least I think I've read that you've signed on with Pantheon to do like a set number of these at a time. If you do 1 through 5 or 1 through 100 with them, you sign that contract and they publish these for you. What makes this different than other book series, though, I think, is the fact that they're published at such a steady rate. Every time that one of these comes out, I always kind of chew through them in a couple days, and even though it's only 6 months, like, I get really excited and anticipate it. But I'm kind of wondering, with a company like Pantheon, if they've ever, I don't know if you're even allowed to discuss something like this, but did they ever try to pressure you into maybe focusing more on a digital release of these? Because I've tried to read these before in a Kindle format, and I don't like it. It's very strange to me to read things that you write. Other books I do. I don't mind to read like in a tablet form, but the things that you write, I don't think they, for me personally, translate as well as they do in the book. In the book, it makes so much more sense when you can hold two sides at one point. Is there any kind of inclination on a publisher's standpoint to maybe go in that direction later on as this plays out?
The question is about physical weight. It's a good one too. I mean, I'm carrying Volume 4 all around the country. It's heavy. I met a guy yesterday at Iowa City, and he was like, he had all of them and some more of the books. He said, everyone looked at me and they said, man, aren't you tired carrying all those books? He said, I do manual labor. So maybe there is that kind of, part of the book in that it constantly insists on its physicality. So before you have to let it go, you actually have to use your muscles, I suppose, to lug it around. It's a physical, it's a manual labor, literally manual labor, right? The hand working its way through those pages. The electronic version is available, in the Apple format. I've heard there's all sorts of problems with the Kindle format. It's basically just a screenshot of each page. I agree with you. I think it loses something. I'm very proud of the electronic versions of the 50-Year Sword and Only Revolutions. Only Revolutions, a lot of love and work went into that. It's told slightly different from the book. We embrace that technology in that it's the Sam and Haley narratives go side by side, so you can track them easily. And it's got about 300 road signs that sort of help you through all the historical references, and there's music and other bits. And 50-Year Sword actually has some animation and music as well. It takes a lot of time. It's a production, and I was thinking a little about this actually as I was walking here, and I was thinking about always that question about the movies, or will it become a television show? And I was thinking, how often we frame books as that, that books kind of arrive when they have this apotheosis, the ascension into another media, and I think my books are much more, insistent on no ascension, no apotheosis. They like living unto themselves. That's what they're going to be. Will it live in electronic formats? Absolutely. Will we get to the end? Who knows? This is a project, as I knew from the start, as Pantheon knew from the start, that is dependent on readers as well. It has my energies. It has pretty much every day an hour of my life. It has my wariness. It has my discoveries. But it will also depend on readers. It will depend upon the vote of those people who believe in something larger, something that's more complex, something that comes from, I guess, a smaller machine. This is a very small little production compared to these large events that orchestrate our attention in this country, in this world.
Hi there. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your inspiration for the Narcons as a narrative device. Just how you came up with that and sort of your process for writing those sections, whether they come at a different, like you write a whole volume and then go back and write some Narcon sections, or do they come while you're writing certain chapters?
The Narcons. I'm flattered that you think I'm the voice of the Narcon. All of the voices are part of a sort of orchestral experience. So there isn't this, you write one thing and then you go back and write another. Even though the characters at present are intersecting very little, they still are singing these kind of thematic motifs, if you will, in different ways. And I think that was actually something that came up while I was on tour. This is a wonderful experience for me, because the experience of going on tour and talking about a book that's already finished it's almost funereal in a way. It's like there's a life that's living in those who are reading the book for the first time, but for the author, it's sort of stepping away from something that is done. But for a series like this, which, as set as it is, I know very clearly the end, and I really hope I get to write it, there is still a lot of room for, improvisation and change. But one of the things that I realized as I was talking about these various characters was I realized that there was a set of other characters, and not just the Narcons, but the themes themselves. And these are these kind of familiar spirits that are moving throughout all the perspectives, whether it's a question of animality, whether it's sort of the politics of voice, whatever these are. And there's a great joy in encountering these kind of figures as they move sort of effortlessly through the world of the familiar. So in many ways, maybe they are breaking some rules. Maybe those themes are the kind of meta narcons that are prohibited. But the narcons are definitely part of the symphony, and they come in as the moments demand, and their voices are, well, there's more to be revealed there, but we know now that there are 3 voices, and they have particular personalities, and they're not omniscient, but they're very knowing, but their knowledge is asymmetrical, and how those interact is sort of crucial. But again, it's also important to realize that the name Narcon comes from a narrative construct, and as sort of fantastical as they may seem when they interrupt and they sort of have a science fiction-like quality, we're all Narcons. We have them. We constantly are creating narratives of ourselves and revising them according to events and moods, and then constantly blinding ourselves to that. So really, I think 3 Narcons in the familiar is kind of modest. I'm sure some of you have many more Narcons.
So it is a cold and windy night here in Philadelphia, and yet your voice has been compelling enough to bring all of us here to hear you speak. Who has or has had a voice that is compelling enough to you? Who has spoken to you that would bring you out on a night like this?
Well, your voices. I sure am not here for me. Oh, God. The first thing that popped into my mind was David Foster Wallace. I'm just saying that's where it was. And I remember hearing him speak at the Skirball Center. And I'm sure in Los Angeles, and I'm sure part of the association is sort of being in an auditorium with microphones as opposed to like a bookstore, and it was always a pleasure to hear how he moved around the questions and the topics of what he wrote, and always kind of addressing that difficulty. And that's a terrible answer, because that almost means that I'm not going to go out for anyone. But that's not true. I'm always interested in new artists. I really like the poet Michael Robbins. I'm a huge fan. She's also a friend of Amy Bender. And I would definitely go through rain and sleet and even great heat to hear those voices.
Hi, thank you. Oh, that's loud. I read an interview in which you described your work process sort of in terms of a Jane Goodall method, and I'm wondering if you're still so patient with your craft. And related to that question, I wonder if aging has changed. Not that you're old, but you're my age. I'm wondering.
We're ancient.
Yeah, compared to some people in this room. But I'm wondering if that has informed your craft or changed the way your devotion to it.
I'm sorry. What was the part of the last question? I didn't hear.
Whether aging has changed your devotion to your craft.
I heard I Ching. I was like, oh, I Ching. Interesting.
Yeah, I Ching.
Yarrow stocks. We're working with Yarrow. Does she know that? How does she know that?
I know. I'm omniscient.
Yes, very much. I think that's why I read the first passage, is that as I get older and as I am undertaking a book that requires the energy that I had when I was 25, I have to evaluate how I don't know how I spend time, where that energy comes from, and what I do realize is that it is how you live your life. It is how you practice and how you become aware that where all the energy is outside of the self. So when you hold on to the self, it kind of, it erupts with some energy, but then it depletes and defeats itself. Whereas, letting go is what allows the larger energies of the world to sustain this project. And that really sounds like a lot of gobbledygook, but the fact is that this book is so hard to write. It takes 6 days a week. It's relentless. You can't take a day off. I'm up every morning at 5:30. I go to the gym. I take yoga classes. I eat well. I go to bed early, and I stay focused like that constantly. And I feel, all the time an enormous amount of weariness as I'm moving through this project. And yet, at the exact same time, I feel an enormous amount of energy. I mean, I am absolutely sustained and stained maybe by what moves through me in this project. And I think part of that is that it's not about me. It's about everything that's outside. I have to go on cab rides with Armenian taxi drivers, go to Singapore, whatever it is, talk to ex-Latino gang members, and it's constantly this world outside that is that's sort of filling my sail, and it is quite enormous. So you mentioned the Jane Goodall, whatever analogy, and it made me laugh, first of all, because when I first started telling it, I was telling it about gorillas, and I said, so Jane Goodall goes into the jungle to look for gorillas. And I was really proud of myself for this analogy, and at the very end, a woman in the back row goes, it was chimpanzees. I was like, you're so right. I guess I was doing like a Fay Ray King Kong thing. But yes, it's chimpanzees. So what I said was that you go into the jungle and you sit there, and you don't move, and you just listen. And you go to the jungle at the same time, and you leave at the same time, and you sit there. And eventually you start to hear the chimpanzees in the distance. And you keep coming back at the same time, and the chimpanzees get closer. And then eventually they start coming right up to you, and they get to know you, and they start telling you their stories. And that's the way it works. You got to sit there every day. You got to listen to those chimpanzees. You got to respect them. You got to be there at that same time. And they've got to earn your trust. And that's how stories come. And if you don't show up, they're going to throw shit at you.
Hi. Well,
this gentleman has raised his hand quite a few times. It's very impressive.
First of all, I love your shirt.
Thank you. Hey.
I forgot my fedora at home. But anyway, my question is, so a lot of your books are about like the typesetting, and the way the font looks on the page, and kind of the kind of font it is in the first place. What kind of goes into those decisions? What about Jing Jing's font speaks Jing Jing, and so on and so forth?
I started this tour for Volume 4 in Utah, and during the day I was invited to a design class, and I had decided to give a few pages from Bendel the Boar, which is a small little story that appears at the very end of Hades. And it was fun because each student got an opportunity to design the text. I gave it no specific fonts. I didn't format it or anything. And it was amazing just how different the results were, and how incomplete they were. They'd been working with the text for a while. So the answer is, basically what I told all the students was that this is a good first run, but now we have to develop it. Now we have to dig deeper. Why are you picking a sans serif font? Why are you, choosing all caps? Why are you setting it in this way? How does this relate actually to the text? And so a lot of the things that plague designers, and some very, very good designers, is that they're not very good readers. They aren't really hearing what the words are saying. They're not hearing the sound of the word. And so they're applying certain rules of like asymmetry or whatever you want to create something that's visually pleasing, but it's completely deracinated from what is going on, textually. And that is actually my labor. It's constant. It's this relationship between how the text looks, how the text speaks, and how to further the meaning of both. So in The Familiar, for example, there was early on a constant evolution of different fonts that had meaning, the way they looked. There was something, for instance, you mentioned Jing Jing, about kind of the smokiness of his thinking, the smokiness of his involvement. So therefore working with a typeface that one could sort of thin out and sort of acquire a smokiness on the page. But even changing the leading or the kerning or fooling around with that would suddenly alter the voice. That's how sensitive I became to those kind of changes. And Xanther went through a few fonts, and her voice was always shifting depending on the density of the text. So the typesetting is going on at the same time. Similar to the question about the narcons, it's not something that's done at the end. You know, it comes, you know, at that moment, and a lot of time is put into that. Now, less time, because they are situated, you know, they have their look, but that's not to say that they can't change a little either.
This might be a simple question. Why do you write?
Yeah, he knew that wasn't a simple question. Got the beard. Why don't I write?
Hi. So you do a lot with obfuscation throughout the familiar. There's a lot of hints at what could be or what might be, or the Narcons do a lot of almost revealing, hinting at future events, past events, or sometimes translating, sometimes not. Is there like a larger structural thing that guides your decision making on what to reveal and what not to, or is it just sort of like a, I don't know, process that, like you said, comes throughout the writing?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, you know, one of the engines of literature is the secret, right? But at what point is the author withholding purely to create an effect for the reader? At which point the author has separated herself from the text and is now just involved in genre, in essence, in just the trade work of creating, you know, a sensation. So for me, for the familiar, the limitations are all in the characters. You know, what do the characters actually know? What are they thinking about? Sometimes you can experience great trauma, but you're not necessarily thinking about it all the time. So the obfuscation that's going on there is through the character. In volume 1, Astaire, all she wants is a dog. So when Xanther comes home with the kitten, she just wants to see the dog. She just keeps trying not to see the cat, you know, and that's her own psychology. Even the Narcons, as kind of elevated as they are, in terms of sort of whatever formal narrative perspectives, are still limited. They too have their personalities. You know, you can find them in their fonts as well, like what kind of notes they're hitting, and they as well have their vistas as well as their kind of tangled woods. So for me, the grounding is always in the characters, and that's the exquisite experience of writing the familiar. It's, you know, it's like, oh, I get to write Xanther today, or oh man, I gotta write Luther today. That's gonna be so hard. He's just in a bad mood. Yeah.
So from what you just said, I kind of gotta wonder: are you an actor? I mean, you have 9, or at least 9 characters. Do you ever think of yourself as acting?
Would you give me an award? I don't, no. But my father was a teacher of actors. You know, he was, at the end of his life, he was the head of the USC theater program. And he, back in the 50s and 60s, was part of Actors Workshop. And so I certainly saw him work with actors. And it's an interesting question, because there is a bit of the method that makes its way into my life, you know, a commitment to a project. I'm gonna always wear a cat shirt. I'm always gonna wear a hat. There are certain sort of performance elements, I guess, when I'm working on each character. There's a certain type of music that they listen to. So, you know, I have all sorts of duduk music playing when Schnork, the Armenian cab driver, is before me, or you might hear Taylor Swift coming out of my window and Xanther's working on. So you know, but I wouldn't call myself an actor by a long shot. I have too much respect for that profession and the kind of work that goes into it, you know. I'm kind of, as I'm aging, coming to grips with the fact that what I do is right here. This is it. I'm not a director. I'm not an ebook director. I'm just able to put words together in a certain way.
Mark, I was really interested in an answer you gave earlier where you said at events like these, something sort of odd is going on where the people in the audience, us, are in the process of living the creation that you had concluded and that you, while you're engaging with us, you're kind of also trying to maybe let it go in some way, thinking about the next project. I'm wondering, an event like this, given the living nature of the work that you do, how, when these events work for you, you know, could you give a sense of how they can be helpful to you or work with you? When these events are good, how is it they help your process?
Well, one thing is you don't always know. Just because an event feels good doesn't mean that it will necessarily bear fruit later on. One of the things that Amy Bender and I have discussed is just about how young writers are constantly judging their work according to how it felt. I felt like I really wrote a great page, and you know, or I wrote badly today, you know. But those feelings you start to realize are irrelevant, and they're kind of a waste of energy, you know, because again, it's all about sort of, you know, making yourself feel good. And the thing is, you don't really know. Like, frequently you'll write something, and this comes through experience, that you felt really great about. You were definitely in the zone. And then, you know, a few months later, you cut it. I mean, volume 1 was 150,000 words long, so think of that as 3 Great Gatsbys. And I cut out 60,000 words, you know, so that sort of kind of gives you that idea. But in terms of how it works, I guess there's somehow a vitality of the adventure itself, of writing something that's this big, you know, of involving so many characters, so many readers, begins to kind of offer you know, little insights into the book itself. And sometimes it's a question, like it highlights a certain thing, like that can be very important, like, oh, that person's really concerned with that. That's interesting to me. Sometimes it can be just like you know, it can be on the way to the airport where the Lyft driver is telling me in Iowa City that he loves to fish, you know, but he doesn't eat the fish. He just throws the fish back. He goes to the supermarket and buys his fish to eat. I thought that was just a great moment. So those moments help too, you know. But I think at present the way I could say it is it's like it's a spotlight, you know, being shown on certain parts, and that sort of brings those parts to life. You know, it's where that interest is, and that's just a very kind of natural occurrence. One thing that I'm doing, it was a sort of a spur of the moment decision, is I decided to have a little reading group before I finished volume 5. The draft for copy editing just went into Pantheon before I started the tour, and kind of on a whim, I thought, you know, embracing your question in this process, why don't we get those readers together who live in LA or are close enough, who've read volumes 1 through 4 and want to discuss it. Now 5 in many ways is set, but there's certain things that can change. I don't know how that's going to work out, but I've never done it before. I haven't really heard of people doing it, so that's kind of a new experience, and stay tuned. I'll let you know how it turned out.
I've always wondered what a first draft of one of your books looks like, or more accurately, what changes between the first draft and the final product. And specifically, do you just have a list of spectacular facts at your beck and call in your head?
No.
Or is there a list of, I need to research what the formula for this is and what medicines do this?
No, I just make it shimmer. That's why you think they're spectacular. No, in fact, my facts can be can be dismayingly off at times. I was in Madison, and I arrived right on time. It was a little complication. I walked in. I was very proud of myself, and I thought, I'm always on time. And everyone was there, and I looked out and I said, were you a little nervous that I wasn't going to show? And they were like, oh, maybe a little. And I said, come on, I was right on time. I'm always on time. And a voice in the back was like, you weren't on time in Chicago. And I was like, oh, what do you mean? You were an hour late. It's like, I was not an hour late. I've never been an hour late to anything. A girl over there goes, yeah, you were an hour late. Another guy would come in from Chicago. Okay, maybe 45 minutes. So it was way off. What does a first draft look like? Well, House of Leaves took me 10 years. Only Revolutions took me 6 intense years. The Familiar's already taken me 10 years. There really isn't a first draft, you know? I mean, there is, but it doesn't really count, you know? It's loose, it's all over the place. It changes in so many ways. I'm often asked the question, I'm sure you've heard this if you've gone to a lot of readings, the obligatory question, which was not asked tonight, what are your influences, right? But I'm always curious about that question, because I think in part it's like, well, what is the origin of this thing? You know, give me that simple thing. And in some ways it's a personal desire to read that influence and maybe experience that influence, right? But we know it's not the case. You know, we know that that monumental moments are preceded by millions of little moments that aggregate into this sort of memorable thing. But if we can get away from this memorable moment, this which is a kind of a blinding moment, then we begin to see more clearly kind of how the world works. So the draft is just in the craft, in the commitment to this. You know, in many ways, the Familiar is about commitment, right? It's about a commitment to a project that's going to span 13 years at least, or 10 to 13 years. You know, it's a commitment to you. It's about continuity. And, you know, what is the source of that? I have no idea, but that's a good one. Like, why commit myself to something big? Maybe because I believe in something bigger. I believe that it matters. I believe that the voices of this world, that inhabit this world, including the voiceless, you know, the animality that's at the center of this book, you know, that which will never have our voice and so never technically deserve citizenry in this world, deserve a place. And that's where my commitment is. And that will forever be all.
So I've had a question on my mind ever since I read House of Leaves, to go back in time a little bit, which is that the book itself wrestles with, and it's referenced specifically, the anxiety of influence, and goes through a catalog of writers, American literature and otherwise, and one always seemed absent, except maybe in the title itself, which is Whitman, and wondered if that was intentional, having had Melville, having had almost every other American great in there, and wondered whether his writing has had an influence on you.
Yeah. Yes. That's interesting. I think Whitman is a huge influence, and I think that becomes more evident in Only Revolutions, you know, but hearing him, well, I guess he could be, he was here tonight too, a little with a little bit about Gettysburg. Certainly poetry was something that I read a great deal of when I was young. I read it in college, and I continue to read it. So Whitman is one of the great American voices, and I will say there have been a few times when I've been introduced as the author of Leaves of Grass. It's a thrilling moment for me.
So I've always wanted to ask somebody who maybe is, you have a lot of people that that love your work, obviously, and have followed you, and your fan base has grown. And I'm curious to know how you, as an author, see yourself when you look at what you've done, maybe both as the voice that you have as an author, but also not in a, I'm going to use the word, in a braggadocious kind of way, but and not a prideful way, but in this is how I see what I am now as an author, maybe as opposed to what you were.
I had this moment right before I came out to the podium. There's a big mirror there. And I thought, I wonder if my hat's on straight. Maybe I should go back to that mirror and look at it. And then I thought, I'm done with mirrors. I don't care about them anymore. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of my energy. Like, my energy's on the familiar. And this question of who I am and how I see myself is becoming more and more duplicitous. And so I give that to you. You can situate me where you want to situate me. And that's not to say that I'm not going to be accountable for myself. I just am not interested in looking at myself in that way. The question is really, what am I doing? What are my actions? How am I helping this situation? How am I growing this garden? How am I taking care of this tree? How are my wife and I, building a home? These are the things of how I interact in the world, and yeah, I'm done with mirrors. Thanks very much.